What's that? Yeah, yeah. She's terrific. So hopefully you'll get to meet her one day as well. So anyway, Paige, we look forward to your presentation. Go
Great,
ahead.
awesome. Thanks so much. Yeah,
you.
and so Robert, you going to be advancing slides, right?
That's correct.
Okay, great. Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me. Yeah, today we're going to talk about an ongoing project that we're working on to explore the sources of uncertainty in electric vehicle load forecasting. So yeah, before I start, I just want to give a really special thanks to Chris Irwin and his team at the Office of Electricity at DOE for supporting and kind of championing this work. And then also want to note some of my colleagues at NREL who are listed here that helped work on it. So you can go to the next slide. So as I think many people here are already aware, the transportation landscape is one that is rapidly changing. We're seeing growing investments in electric vehicles and charging infrastructure. We're seeing decreasing vehicle costs, longer range vehicles, as well as state and federal policies that are really aimed at decarbonization. So all of these things are pointing to a future that likely will have many more electric vehicles on the road than we have today. And with all of these vehicles, obviously, is going to come more electricity demand. But it's unclear really what all this future load will look like. So that's what we're trying to get at here, kind of understanding all of those sources of uncertainty. So next slide. So again, while we're really expecting probably high levels of transportation electrification, there's still a lot of uncertainty in exactly how much load there's going to be and when and where that load is going to occur. So this uncertainty is really driven by a multitude, many different factors, and some of these, or many of these, are shown in the figure on the left. So kind of small font, but essentially it's ranging from things like vehicle technology, so what battery costs and vehicle range are going to be, to also charging infrastructure availability, to policy, to even kind of larger macro trends like population shifts and climate change. All of those things are going to impact load and subject to a lot of uncertainty. So even thinking about kind of like all of these sources at an aggregated or a national level is a challenge. If you kind of go to the left side, things get even more complicated when you're trying to estimate the more local impacts of load. So it's both local to a specific region or local to a specific time. So it's kind of like is illustrated in this cartoon. If you're considering just national or more regionally aggregated average estimates of load, they're not really telling the whole story, since there's going to be cases where load is going to be way above or way below the average that are important in thinking about planning. So in our ongoing work, we're really trying to characterize these many sources of uncertainty that can impact load, and then how that uncertainty might vary when you're looking at different levels of resolution or different time scales. So most importantly, as well as characterizing this uncertainty, we want to do it in a way and summarize findings in a way that are useful and actionable for both like the developers of load forecasts, but also other stakeholders in this forecasting process. So, despite all of this daunting uncertainty, what steps can really be taken now, what data can be used to help deal with it and do the best we can with what we have. So I'm interested to present to this group because, in addition to any questions, I'm really interested in hearing feedback on, how this information is helpful, what other resources you'd like to see that kind of can help support, what you do in the regulatory process. Okay, so next slide. So to try to categorize uncertainty and kind of organize insights, we've broken down uncertainty into the primary dimensions that impact load. So these are all the things on the left side. So we have adoption and ownership. So essentially how many vehicles are sold and how many vehicles are on the road. So, what's the sales and the stock of electric vehicles. And then load is also impacted by vehicle use and travel behavior. So what's the travel demand for these vehicles? How many miles are they driven? Then as well as energy intensity. So what's the energy consumed per unit of travel? And then as well as charging behavior and technology. So when and where and how these vehicles are going to be charged. So we'll go into detail on each of these dimensions in the next slide. So this is kind of a summary here. And then so in addition to the dimensions, sorry, if you could go back, Robert. So those are the dimensions of uncertainty. And then we've also tried to differentiate kind of different types of uncertainty or variability. So the first type is something that we're calling inherent heterogeneity. So this is getting at the fact that these dimensions are going to look different, even today across different regions and across different times. So there's inherent heterogeneity around all these dimensions even today. And then the second type of uncertainty is forecast uncertainty, or really, uncertainty about the future. So obviously we don't have a crystal ball. We don't know how the future is going to play out across all of these different factors, like on the previous slide, that can impact load. So different sources of uncertainty coming in, and then combining these dimensions with the uncertainty, with the variability, is going to impact how much load we have, where it will be, and when it will occur. So now you can go to the next slide. Thanks. So this question of how much load, so kind of an aggregate or total load, is a combination of mostly those three factors, or those three dimensions on the last slide. So adoption, ownership, adoption and ownership, vehicle use, and energy intensity. And so we kind of tried to summarize this in this chart, and there's a lot packed in this chart, but what we're trying to highlight is that changes in any of those factors or any of those dimensions and in any direction can impact load. So on the x-axis of this chart is EV ownership. So it's a combination of EV adoption or sales, and then as well as just how many vehicles are owned. So this is really what are the number of EVs that are in operation is the x-axis. And then the y-axis is energy use. And energy use is a combination of the energy intensity of the vehicle, and then as well as how that vehicle is used or how many miles driven. So this is what we've summarized in the metric as the annual electricity use, or annual kilowatt hours per vehicle. So when you multiply these two things together, so multiplying EVs, which is the x-axis, and average load per vehicle, which is the y-axis, gives us total load. And then moving up and right along that chart results in more load. And so all of those kind of categories on the right of this figure show examples of factors of uncertainty for each of those dimensions, and then how they impact load in either direction. I won't go into detail because there's a lot to cover there, but you can kind of review just some examples of, all potential uncertainty and how it can impact load in either direction. But this is really kind of an aggregated or maybe average view. And again, this helps us kind of inform what's the total load going to be. But when you drill down further into where and when that load is going to occur, that's going to be more determined by regional characteristics and how some of these factors here are going to vary across different regions. So the next slide will go into detail on each of these dimensions and then how we should be considering uncertainty in each of these cases. So the first dimension is adoption. Just checking my time. Okay. And so with, we laid out a lot of those recent trends on the first slide. And then also if you just look at kind of recent regional data or policy announcements, which are shown in this upper right chart, it really seems like the future is headed towards one with rapid growth in EV adoption. But while, maybe rapid growth, this growth really can be hard to predict. So many historical projections have been underestimating the actual rate of growth that we've seen. And so you can see this on the chart on the lower right, which shows estimates from EIA's annual energy outlook over the years, and how those projections keep getting adjusted to go upward and upward over time. So this is just kind of one example from one source that's showing that predicting adoption is really, really hard because it depends on a lot of different factors, consumer preferences, markets, et cetera. So in our current work, we're really not going into detail in all those complexities that are involved with predicting adoption specifically, but instead we're trying to show that, even if adoption was for certain, or maybe we're assuming that you're meeting a target like the 50% EV sales by 2030, there's still a ton of uncertainty that remains outside of adoption. So for example, while it might be someone else's role to develop an adoption forecast, so maybe that's coming from us at a national lab or someone else in the transportation analysis space, or maybe that assumption is even informed by policy or targets. It's really still, there's a lot of uncertainty, and it's still important to understand how to apply those adoption projections to a forecast, and then also to understand kind of what are the limitations in those adoption projections. So an example is on the next slide. So for example, even if we do know national adoption, there's a lot of variability in exactly where that adoption is happening. So this map shows EV sales in 2022 by county. So even though nationally there was 7% sales share in 2022 as a whole, some counties like in California were closer to 20 or 30%, so already reaching really high levels. And then on the other hand, you have some counties that were essentially at 0%. So using a national average like adoption trajectory is really not going to accurately represent what the load looks like in those regions. So it's an actionable item that are highlighted on the green boxes in these slides. For forecasting, we think it's important to understand what's the local EV market maturity to help kind of inform these EV adoption assumptions. So if a region is leading in sales today, or maybe they're lagging in sales, it's likely going to continue to do so at least, in the near to midterm. So it's important to understand, what's the situation today to inform the near to midterm. But in the long term, if we think about heading towards a future maybe with very high penetrations of EVs, like maybe we're getting close to 100% sales, then some of these regional differences in adoption is that some of these regional differences might converge over time, as now the lagging regions are starting to catch up. So we really need to be careful in how to think about these regional differences in adoption and how we apply those over time. And not just with adoption, there's other examples of kind of extrapolating recent trends to the future as we start to get a more mature EV market. Next slide. So another important regional consideration that impacts kind of this number of EVs on the road again is just general vehicle ownership trends. So to start here, I just want to clarify that vehicle sales do not equal vehicle stock. So new vehicle sales each year, at least for personal light duty vehicles that we drive, new vehicle sales account for just 5% of the stock. So it takes a lot of time for those sales to have a large impact on the vehicle stock. And stock is really the key metric for load, since that's the fraction of vehicles on the road that are demanding electricity. And so the speed of how vehicle sales translate into stock or stock turnover, what we call it, is determined by vehicle ownership trends. And a lot of those trends can also vary regionally. So you can kind of see this in the chart. It's showing the average age of household vehicles. So if a region has a preference for newer vehicles, like you see in some urban areas, California, Texas, New York, that stock is going to turn over faster. Whereas some regions or some counties may hold onto their vehicles longer. They may have a preference for used vehicles. And so then that stock is going to turn over slower. So this all impacts kind of the rate of load growth in different regions. So for forecasting, it's important to kind of consider these local factors of ownership, and that can really help apply adoption projections more robustly to more accurately estimate impacts of load. Okay, next slide. So that was kind of the number of EVs metric. This next one is getting into vehicle use and travel behavior. And again, this is another dimension that also varies regionally. So vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, is impacted by many, many things, but it can be like population density, can be impacted by access to public transit, vehicle ownership, and other factors as well. So for example, if you consider like a dense urban area like New York that has good access to public transit, lower vehicle ownership, that area is going to drive less miles per vehicle than a rural area, which has large distances between destination, and it really only relies on personal vehicles for travel. So important to consider those characteristics that vary regionally. But then it's also important, or there's also uncertainty or variability regionally, but there's also uncertainty in how VMT might evolve over time. So again, that forecast uncertainty. So VMT, or vehicle miles traveled, again, is generally expected to grow as the population and as the economy grows. But it could also be impacted by things like new technologies and business models. So things like autonomous vehicles or ride hailing like Uber and Lyft. These are all going to have different VMT impacts than just how you and I drive our personal vehicles. And then if you think about decarbonization, we might see certain strategies to decarbonize that are aimed at reducing VMT. So things like improving public transit access or better urban planning. So again, all are going to impact vehicle use, which then will impact load. And this area specifically, I think, of projecting VMT is really one that's being studied in the transportation space. So it's not a utility's job, for example, to really come up with what VMT is going to look like in the future, considering all of these different technologies and scenarios and strategies. But I think it is important for forecasts and sensitivities of these forecasts to be informed by maybe other analysis efforts in the transportation space. So maybe it can influence sensitivities in the forecast where maybe they're not developing themselves, but informing them from other efforts. And then again, kind of in this green box, should also consider, again, forecasts of VMT or estimates of VMT, should also consider that regional heterogeneity that can impact load. Okay, moving along the next slide. So that's vehicle use and travel behavior. The next one is energy intensity. So the next dimension of load, and that's how many kilowatt hours are consumed per mile of travel. So this metric, again, is impacted by many different factors. So one of them is vehicle size. So if you think of larger vehicles like an SUV or a pickup, they're going to have lower energy efficiency, higher energy demands than, a compact or a mid-sized vehicle. And then you can also think about, medium and heavy duty trucks, which are even more energy intensive. It's also impacted by temperature, since more auxiliary load is needed for heating and cooling both the cabin and the battery. And it's also impacted by road grade, driving style, and other conditions, like congestion. So all these impact energy efficiency, and many of them vary by region. So you can see in the chart, the maps show you the share of SUVs and share of pickups for different counties, where higher share is going to be higher energy intensity. And then the chart on the bottom shows energy consumption by month compared to a baseline for different cities. So if you have a colder or a hotter region like Phoenix or Minneapolis, they're going to have higher energy consumption than more mild climates like LA, for example. Then we also have to consider technology improvements in electric vehicles that might improve vehicle efficiency, and that can also have a large impact on load. So for forecasting, again, important to consider these regional variations that can all impact load, and then also consider assumptions on important future conditions like EV efficiency projections, and those can be based on other robust sources. Okay, so the last dimension on the next slide is charging behavior and technology. So many of those previous slides got into kind of how much load and where that load will be, but charging behavior is really starting to get into the when, or kind of the load shape part of the equation. So EV load shape is affected by availability of charging infrastructure, and as well as how that charging infrastructure depends on building stock. So for example, do you have residential charging? It's also impacted by charging power and technology, and then just general preferences. So how people prefer to charge, or people or businesses prefer to charge. So the chart on the top shows how load shape changes with a home dominant charging scenario on the left. And this is where most people use, residential home-based charging. And then that's compared to a no home charging scenario where most people rely on workplace or public charging. And you can see that those load shapes look very different. So understanding the local availability of charging infrastructure can, better inform kind of these expected load profiles and impact on load shapes. And as we kind of mentioned before, a really important nuance here is that current trends, what we see in today's data is really based more on early adopters of electric vehicles and may not reflect future conditions where EVs start to penetrate a higher share of the market. So for example, the chart on the bottom shows the share of EVs with home charging access as a function of EV stock share for various scenarios. So as EV penetration increases, reaches a larger share of the market, they're adopted by owners that are less likely to have home charging. So while today load profiles might look more like the top left of that chart with higher home charging, load profiles in the future might look more like the top right, where you have a lower share of households that have residential charging. Okay, next slide, just two more. So if there isn't, enough uncertainty that we already talked about, all of these dimensions get even more challenging to project at higher and higher levels of resolution. So projecting load for a very specific individual household, a business fleet, that's very hard to predict those actions at a high level of resolution and certainty. So this chart just kind of shows that example as you move on to lower levels of regional aggregation, so moving from national to state to county, you start to see higher levels of variability. And then we kind of illustrate on the right that this even likely gets much higher as you go to like census tract or neighborhood level estimates. All of these different dimensions of uncertainty can compound and layer when you're talking about a certain specific area, and that's leading to a wider range of potential outcomes. So given all of these challenges, of estimating load at a higher resolution, we've kind of flagged in the green box here that solutions to manage load growth should allow for regional flexibility. So essentially providing resources to support load growth in general, but not dictating upfront exactly when or where that should be directed, because that's a challenge. So examples here are like make-ready programs or line extension policies that are kind of examples that include some of this flexibility. Last slide. So yeah, this is in summary. I won't go over it here, but kind of just a synthesis of all of these insights and what we think are characteristics that make up a good load forecast. So yeah, considering all dimensions of load and drawing on analysis from other disciplines where necessary, considering local factors and local data, being cautious when you're extrapolating current trends to future scenarios, and then as well as trying to include uncertainty and key assumptions in the forecast. And this kind of uncertainty aspect, I think, is a responsibility both of forecasters to consider uncertainty, but it's also, I think, important for the broader analysis community to provide, transparent data, transparent analysis to help inform some of those uncertainty bounds that then can lead into the forecasting exercises. So that's all I have. Yeah, thanks so much for the opportunity. Again, in addition to any questions on this, I'm really interested to hear feedback on, how this information is helpful. What else would you like to see that can help, support your efforts specifically?
Paige, that was great. Thank you ever so much. And look forward to perhaps some questions for you after the other two presentations. So again, thank you. And next we have Sean Morash from Telos Energy. Sean is a principal at Telos Energy with experience across a range of topics, including power system modeling, transmission and distribution planning, and technology integration. For the last 10 years, Sean has worked on projects that combine the traditional disciplines of economics, engineering, technology, and policy, and he specializes in conveying complex electric sector themes to a range of stakeholder audiences. He leads the Energy Systems Integration Group, ESIG, grid planning for a vehicle electrification task force, and wrote his undergraduate thesis on vehicle to grid integration. And if you've read the excellent paper from ESIG, Charging Ahead, Grid Planning for Vehicle Electrification, that came out in January of this year, Sean's name was front and center because he prepared that really very valuable document. So Sean, look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm glad you were able to read it and found value in it. I'm going to give, this is, we have a 100-page report out there. It's available at this location, and we can drop a link in the chat. So trying to summarize a 100-page report in 15 minutes and a couple of slides is really tricky. But I think we can do it. Before we get going, I really I had the joy of wrangling a bunch of different voices in pulling this together. Many thanks to the Department of Energy and Lawrence Berkeley National Lab for kind of helping sponsor this work. And then also to the various voices that contributed to the work, right? The value here was that it was a lot of, different perspectives. So we had utilities, we had vehicle manufacturers, we had, aggregators, environmental stakeholders, and then also some of you folks. I recognize some names on this webinar that were in some of those meetings as well. So thanks to all those folks, and go ahead and go into the next slide. One of the things I like to do is to help kind of anchor, we hear a lot about EVs and a lot about all this growth and a lot of, there's a lot of things changing that we can sometimes become numb to, what these numbers mean, what these kind of exponential curves look like. So one of the things I like to anchor to is, okay, you can pull a couple of different stats together, and there's really the slide, the top left here, where we've got, we think about the stationary battery storage market today in the US, or not even market, but how much battery storage is deployed. It's about 25 gigawatt hours. And there's about 2 million EVs on the road, and you can do some back of the envelope math, and you come up to 126 gigawatt hours, right? So this is something like 5 times more storage in the EVs today than in the grid scale batteries that we've got deployed. So this is already a pretty big, aggregation of resources at the grid edge, and it's expected to continue to grow. And importantly, this is at the grid edge, right? Our work was primarily oriented around distribution planning and what we do in the distribution world. So thinking about this, demand from one EV is, roughly equivalent to adding a new house there. Peak demand, you kind of align your peaks on different things. And and with that reality, it only takes a couple of EVs charging at the same place to overwhelm that distribution system capacity. Paige got into adoption rates. One of the things we like to anchor to also is generally high level costs, right? What are we talking about in terms of grid upgrades? There's a number of different sources you could go to. I think I pulled the highest one that I had found for this slide, which is $200 billion in distribution investments by 2050 to enable EVs. And that's incremental to what we were already thinking about upgrading. So this is big numbers, right? That's really kind of what I'm trying to convey here. All right, go to the next slide. I'm actually going to have you skip this one, and we'll go here for a second. I'm skipping that one just because I think Paige covered what I was going to say on that one. So she covered some of this as well, but I think it's a slightly different framing where we think about, okay, if we want to plan for our distribution system, we need to understand when are folks, gonna adopt EVs, right? We don't want to be too early, don't want to be too late. Where, right? Both, across a state, a region, even within a service territory. And then also where, are they going to charge at home? Are they going to charge at work? Are they going to charge kind of somewhere in between when they're driving? And those two things are really kind of commingled with the timing of charging, right? So it's location and timing are there's this kind of relationship where, hey, if you charge at home, most likely you're going to charge at night. If you charge out in public somewhere, most of the time you're going to do that during the daytime, right? And so there's this relationship between the two where they're both informative of each other, basically, where it's hard to hold one stable and manipulate the other because they're so intermingled. And so with that, we're like, okay, well, how do we plan this? How do we plan this stuff? Given the various sources of uncertainty that Paige talked about, and also generally kind of even I'm going to use a little simpler language, just kind of adoption rates, location, and timing. What do we do? What's our first steps as grid planners? And so as the task force, we'll go ahead and go to the next one. As a task force, we came up with priority actions that we can take today, right? We don't want to be too far into the future. There's this issue where we have these long range plans that utilities have a tough time converting into actionable kind of near-term plans. And then more so, regulators have a tough time tracing the path from 2050 goals to, okay, what do we do today to make sure we're in a good place to get there? So we came up with 4 things. Go on to the next one. Number 1, improve your forecasting, right? There's a number of ways we can do this. This one boils to the top because even the folks who were leading forecasters, right? Who the industry thought was doing a pretty good job. Even those folks felt like there were things they could do better, right? That they wanted to capture better, that they wanted to communicate better to their audiences. Number 2 was embrace smart charging. So this came about, right, because there's smart charging is capable of going after grid challenges at multiple levels, right? We could do it at the premise level, at maybe a feeder or circuit level, substation, and on up. And there's a variety of different ways that smart charging can take place, depending on what you're trying to achieve. The third one and the fourth one here really go together, but it's this idea that we need to start moving, really. And one of the ways is through future-ready equipment. I'm going to get into a little bit of what that means. But it generally involves upsizing infrastructure when it's due to be replaced, so that long term we're in a better place. So that's kind of phased in over time. And then the fourth bullet here is around proactive upgrades, right? And this isn't intended to be, hey, a blank check for everybody go make your proactive upgrades. but rather, think through consciously where would a proactive upgrade make the most sense, so that we can stage these investments so that the grid is prepared to handle these this amount of EV charging that we're expecting. So I'm going to work through each of these four, and then I'll leave you with something else. Next slide, please. So yeah, our forecasting. I think Paige did a good job here. I use slightly different words, and I don't really want to conflate some of what she said. But I do think for me that there was kind of a big aha in terms of capturing the use case of a vehicle, right? And so this is not necessarily the shape of the vehicle, right? So two buses could, they look the same make and model, but they could be used very differently, right? A commuter bus versus a school bus, they're going to want to charge at different times. They're going to have different energy needs throughout the day, throughout the week, throughout the year. And so trying to capture those in as much fidelity as we can, I think will help a lot with our forecasting. Similarly, we stressed the importance of using scenarios. No one forecast is right. None of them are right. But hopefully, the more we use, the more insights we can get, the more useful those forecasts become. Going to the next one, Robert. So this was, point 2 here was around embracing smart charging. And my kind of soapbox here is that smart charging is very different than kind of your traditional demand management. Across the variety of pilot programs or in practice programs, we see significantly more demand response or kind of peak reduction or just generally better behavior out of EV charging, manipulation, out of smart charging, than we did from traditional demand response or thermostat demand response. And a lot of that is, hey, these chargers have, your EV has more flexibility to charge than your thermostat maybe, but also a lot of it can be automated, right? And so the automation unlocks some capability to target different grid levels, right? So with your variety of kind of objectives. So there's some really interesting stuff you can do around smart charging that avoids kind of premise level constraints, but still meets the energy needs of your EV. Or hey, you can we've got our time of use rates that can generally shape EV charging, and so in making sure that we coordinate across our different objectives to make sure that we're not addressing one thing but making something else worse, is something else that really is important here as we think through our smart charging strategies. Going to the next one. Does this incorporate future ready equipment? We equipment standards and generally, how these things work. It's like the more you learn about it, the more you realize there's a lot to learn. And so the concept here is, hey, when equipment is ready for upgrade, go ahead and put in a bigger piece of equipment, because the marginal cost of that infrastructure isn't so bad, especially when you factor in kind of labor costs of installation, but also kind of engineering or inventory, all the components that go into hanging a piece of equipment in the field. But trying to untangle that a little bit to say, okay, hey, we know that our legacy equipment is maybe not big enough. So what should our new equipment sizing be? Well, that's a tough question to answer, right? And it really depends regionally, but it also depends on or it needs to be coordinated with your smart charging strategies. So there's this thing that utilities lean on that's kind of buried in all these assumptions around around the diversity of loads. So this is basically, hey, how many are how many folks are charging at the same time. And there's some calculations we can do, but the trick here is that, as we get more and more chargers or more and more EVs, we are less likely to all be charging at the same time. But our service transformers and our kind of really grid edge type stuff, those serve not that many customers, and so the odds that me and my neighbor happen to be charging at the same time, well, that's better than the odds of me and 20 neighbors all charging at the same time. And so thinking through that is something that some utilities are doing, but I think we need more study on it. I think we need more generally acceptance of kind of what those values ought to be as we think through our kind of our smart charging and our equipment standards. It's all kind of one big puzzle here. So yeah, Robert, go on to the next one, where we've got our kind of our fourth bullet here. Our fourth big one was around promoting proactive upgrades. There was some really good work out of National Grid where they were showing, hey, in order to meet some of our policy objectives, we've got to start building some stuff, right? This stuff takes time to build. And their point, and kind of a broader point here around getting proactive and thinking through that is kind of asymmetric risk, right? There's risk on either side when we start building stuff, right? One is, hey, you can overbuild it, and that can lead to expensive underutilization, inequitable burden of costs, or stuff that's generally not all that used. But if we underbuild it, right, then we've got an unreliable grid. We've got potentially stunted interests in EVs, and the one that that a lot of the vehicle manufacturers and aggregators were really pointed about was longer wait times for charger installs, right? Some of these fleet operators who want to install something and get told, hey, yeah, that's great, we can do it in 5 years. Like, that's not really an acceptable answer for them, right? They're ready to do it now, and if we're going to meet some of these policy goals, we need to think through how to do that more quickly, right? And potentially smart charging is one of those options. The last thing, Robert, going to the next. The last thing I want to leave with is around process and practice. Kind of, it's called adaptations here, but it's really around a new way of thinking to make sure that we are addressing the challenge as holistically. So going to the next one here, where we've got our existing processes where utilities kind of annually review systems. They kind of regularly update the grid plans. They review these interconnection requests in isolation, as they come up. And that's great. That works for some things. We also hear often around a need for kind of proactive or multi-stakeholder processes that say, hey, let's all get together, think through kind of, hey, where does our charging corridor need to be? There's a great example in California and the West Coast around I-5, thinking through that kind of charging corridor as they want to get freight traffic electrified up and down the West Coast. And that requires coordination across a ton of entities. The thing we introduced here that was new, or maybe we were the first folks to label it, is this customer collaborative process where we think through really the utilities or the grid planners and the fleet operators or even just the folks trying to communicate they work together to figure out a solution that makes the most sense. So they provide kind of multiple options for interconnection. Maybe that's smart dynamic interconnection that says, hey, don't charge. You can charge as much as you want during the overnight hours, but don't charge during the peak. Or hey, yeah, you can't charge there, but like a mile down the road is fine. Generally, the concept is, the answer to an interconnection request doesn't have to be yes or no. There's a bunch of shades in between. And so there's, I've got a slide on the next one here that talks through a couple different use cases and kind of the suitability of each of these processes to address that need, right? So I talked about our managed kind of light duty vehicles. Existing processes can more or less handle that, where depending on what your assumptions are. But when we think about kind of charging of fleet vehicles, you think about like a USPS or like an Amazon center that wants to electrify their depot. That's where this customer collaborative process pops in, and it can be really helpful for folks to understand the trade-offs with what they're trying to accomplish. So we'll go to my last one, which is really just a recap of what we talked about. There's lots of unknowns, but we need to make some decisions today. There's opportunities to improve forecasting, but also to help shape kind of public and customer perception on what, there's headlines around, can the grid handle AI? Can the grid handle EVs? These are really important topics. Secondly, my soapbox around smart charging will be helpful. We've got to learn some stuff. There's some gaps in knowledge across grid planners and various folks. But also, go ahead and lean into it is one of what I'm advocating for. And then the last thing is that a lot of what we've talked about is not necessarily part of existing kind of normal activities. So these future-ready systems, reconsidering those design standards, that happens like once every decade or two. And then these kind of different processes, really need to be stood up, outside of your annual processes that exist today. So that's what we talked about. There's a whole lot more information at the link. And then the other thing I wanted to make sure I left us with, Robert, go ahead and switch over to that last one. We're kicking off a new initiative with eSig on EV load forecasting. We're literally just kicking it off, so I don't have a ton of information to share. But we're trying to engage really NREL, this group, to make sure that we are addressing the right questions. We were supposed to come up with an EV load forecasting guide that helps us kind of step through, here's the steps that we would need to take with EV load forecasting. And we want to make sure that guide is useful for the folks on the phone here who ultimately we hope will use it. So if you're interested in learning more about that or helping shape what that becomes, go ahead and reach out to me. I think we may stand up a kind of more formal interactive activity, but in the meantime, go ahead and reach out to me, and we will make sure you're invited to those activities as they come up. So thank you.
Excellent. Sean, thank you ever so very much for that presentation and for your continuing work here. And last presenter, Dr. Sergici from the Brattle Group, Boston office, specializing in innovative retail rate design and economic analysis of distributed energy resources. Dr. Sergici regularly assists her clients in matters related to electrification, grid modernization, investment, emerging utility business models, and alternative rate-making mechanisms. So 2 areas of expertise critical to us. One is forecasting, and the other is rate design. So, but today you're going to talk about your study, ERCOT study, that looks at load impact at the substation level, which kind of ties together the local forecasting and distribution, side of things as well. So really interested to hear your presentation, Dr. Sergici. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Commissioner, and for having me talk about our work for ERCOT, which we completed early last year. So Sean and Paige has done a great job of kind of laying the foundations for why uncertainty is increasing, and what is the implications of not bounding this uncertainty, in which case we will need to deal with the implications of these increasing charging and load impacts and in grid planning implications. So this study is essentially an effort to kind of bound that uncertainty on ERCOT's behalf, and they essentially have started with the premise that, okay, we know that EVs are coming, we know that forecasting is just only an effort to try to get more information, but let's give this a try, because sitting and waiting for these EVs to materialize and just show up wherever they're going to show up is not a meaningful option. So at least try to get a feel for where they may likely to show up, so that we can tailor our long-term system planning and transmission planning efforts accordingly. So you could move to the next slide. And I think that this is essentially what Paige and Sean covered really well. I don't have to go over this, but the idea is that, you know, EVs are being adopted, and they are going to increase at a faster pace with all this emphasis on transportation electrification. For a while, you know, we were focused at forecasting it at a higher level, you know, 10 million, 15 million, 20 million EVs, but that's not going to do it anymore. We are now interested in understanding locational distribution of these EV forecasts, so that we can estimate the impacts on the local grids. But before moving on to the ERCOT study, I just wanted to also touch base on another piece of work that we've completed a couple of years ago. If you could go to the next slide, Robert. So before we zoom in on those locational impacts, what we wanted to do is, by looking at the adoption experience over the past 12 years in the US, combining data from all states over these past 12 years in terms of light-duty vehicle adoption levels. And we've collected a bunch of additional variables, such as vehicle incentives, states and city-specific programs, charging infrastructure availability, battery prices, fuel costs, model availability. It's a very rich specification. We try to build an econometric model to explain historically what drove market share of light-duty vehicles. And we found that several of these variables were statistically significant and explaining meaningful levels of EV adoption, like charging infrastructure. We found a 10% increase in public ports increased EV sales by 0.3%. Every 10 additional EV models increased EV sales by 2%. $1,000 increase in total incentive increases EV sales by 3.2%. So, you know, even though this model's forecasting capability will be limited to near term, because historical behaviors will only be informative for a little while until it changes again, but we were still able to leverage this model to be able to get a lot of insights when we are doing our benefit cost analysis, because sometimes you needed to know, for every dollar of incentive that I spent on this program, what is the additional adoption that I'm enabling? Or similarly, when we are investigating the benefit cost ratio of an infrastructure program, you need to know, you know, how many additional EVs that this charging infrastructure will lead to the adoption of. So just wanted to just put it out there, because I know that there are a lot of folks interested in understanding the drivers and quantification of the relationships. So with the caveat that, you know, just maybe this will be informative for another couple of years, and now we need to re-estimate and relook at the parameters. But let's just move on to ERCOT's analysis, because it's been a very informative exercise for us doing the work at Brattle as well as at ERCOT. It was one of the few initial cases of trying to do something like this, which is to take a regional forecast and try to distribute that forecast to a very granular levels at the substation level. And again, the driver for ERCOT to do this is that they wanted to use this in their system planning assessment, and they needed an interactive tool that could be used to easily replicate and understand, update their analysis in the future. So we gave them something, and we made it such that they're able to update as more information becomes available to them, so that, you know, this model, this tool is going to become dynamic. And as it gets more information, hopefully the forecasts and, you know, information out of this model will become more useful. But what we delivered in the end is using mostly Texas-specific and publicly accessible data. We generated representative 24-hour load profiles for each of roughly 4,000 substations at ERCOT for 8 years, 4 seasons, and 2 day types, weekends and weekdays. So they have this tool, they can pick up a given substation, and they can essentially see how the load is going to increase in that substation due to increasing EV adoption, which is, you know, inclusive of LDVs, medium and heavy duty vehicles. And when we were doing this work, we were in close coordination with the TDSPs in the ERCOT service territory, because they already knew locations of some of these regional fleet bus depots and charging locations. So we incorporated already known locations for those developments. The next slide, please. So, so inherently, this is a methodology presentation. So this whole exercise was developing a very transparent methodology to allocate those EVs to substation levels. So I'm going to keep my presentation at a very high level, because there are lots of details as to how we've done this allocation by the use case of the EVs, by the location that we are allocating to. There's so many assumptions, and they're all documented on this 100-page report that we have put together for ERCOT, which is on ERCOT's website. But at a super high level, there were 3 steps in our analysis. The first step is to establish light, medium, and heavy-duty EV adoption forecasts for 2022 through 2029. So it's like 8 years of a time frame. And ERCOT already had some existing forecasts for these 3 different EV types. So we have verified and improved upon their forecast and build out adoption forecast for more granular list of medium and heavy duty vehicles. So we've used the more detailed categories of heavier vehicles for them. Then the second step is to, now that we know at a high level what the forecast is, now let's allocate that adoption forecast to individual ERCOT substations. And we use separate methodologies for allocating light duty vehicles and medium heavy duty vehicle allocations. And we first allocated these vehicles to zip codes, and now from zip codes, we've allocated them to substation levels. And then the last step in our analysis is, okay, so now that we know where these EVs will locate to, let's just calculate their charging implications based on where they charge, at which level they charge. So we basically put that analysis together, and that's kind of what really matters for our cost planning purposes. What additional peak loading that they could expect on those substations. The next slide, please. So as I said, we've initially made some adjustments to ERCOT's forecasts, relatively small adjustments to their light-duty vehicle forecast, but more major adjustments to their MHDV forecasts. They initially had only 3 vehicle classes. We grouped MHDVs into 5 classes consistent with Federal Highway Administration's gross vehicle weight ratings and also ERCOT's vehicle class segmentation. We've started with our Delphi survey for expectations for medium and heavy duty vehicles in the next 10 years. A couple of years ago, we at Brattle undertook a Delphi survey of industry experts, and we've captured their expectations on what they think market shares will be for different types of medium heavy duty vehicles. And I think we've surveyed about 12 experts and used the distribution of their forecasts to derive the expectations around medium heavy duty vehicles. The challenge with forecasting a very nascent technology is that there's not much of a historical information that you could look at. Therefore, the next best thing is to talk to experts who are tracking this area and capture their expectations. So that's what we've done. And we've incorporated some of this information in coming up with ERCOT's forecast for medium heavy duty vehicles. And we've considered buses, transit buses, and school buses separately from these weight classes. The next slide, please. We could move to the next slide. So now that we have the forecast, so we needed to come up with our allocation methodology. As I mentioned, we have a different methodology for light duty vehicles and medium heavy duty vehicles. So ERCOT a lot of unique aspects in terms of competition. They have laws associated with competitive choice areas, and they have non-opt-in entities, which are munis and co-ops that didn't opt into competition. So ERCOT has different data requirements and data processes for different substations. So we've kind of tailored our approach to unique attributes of ERCOT, which I'm not going to go into here. But the bottom line is we created propensity scores of adoption for allocating these light duty vehicles to each of the zip codes in the ERCOT service territory. And this propensity score is essentially taking into account variables like income, population density, already existing registrations, already existing level of EV adoption. You're just trying to come up with a metric that will tell you, okay, how likely it is that, you know, this an individual in this zip code is going to get an EV in the next year and the next year. So the main driver of our allocation approach for light duty vehicles is that propensity score that we create, use that to allocate to zip codes, and now from zip codes we allocate to substations based on the non-coincident peak of given substations. The next slide, please. So yeah, so I think that I've already at a very high level captured this propensity score piece, but you know, there's a lot of literature out there in terms of, again, explaining individuals' likelihood of adopting EVs. We had done some work with EPRI on this and found that income and population density were two key indicators of a given geographic locations of propensity to adopt EV. And we introduced historical adoption and total vehicle registrations to come up with, again, for each zip code, a propensity score. And we use this propensity score to allocate our EVs to these zip codes. The next slide, please. So, you know, when we have gone through this exercise, we have found that our allocation has concentrated adoption primarily in urban and suburban zip codes surrounding major cities. You know, we've basically identified highest adoption zip codes in 2029, and we have found that they all started out with relatively high adoption in 2022, again, by constructed because it was part of our propensity score metric. And, you know, we essentially created these heat maps, essentially showing, you know, where we could expect those light duty vehicles to be concentrated at. And if you know your Texas, you will see that, you know, Dallas, Fort Worth area, and also Houston and Austin and some of the San Antonio area are the ones that we expect most of the LDV adoption to take place. The next slide, please. So MHDV allocation is it followed a similar approach, but it was much more nuanced, because going back to what Sean and Paige both mentioned, use case really matters for MHDVs, because depending on the use case of the vehicles, adoption patterns differ, geographical locations of where they may materialize matter, and their charging attributes matter. So we really took into account lots of information about where these vehicles currently are, medium and heavy duty non-electric vehicles, and then what factors may explain electrification of those existing medium heavy duty vehicles. Could move to the next slide. So again, our approach is a 4-step approach here. In the first step, we identify primary use case within each class. In the second step, we identify proxies for the number of vehicles at a given location. So one challenge with MHDVs is that unlike LDVs, we didn't have current registration information at the zip code level for medium and heavy duty vehicle. So we needed to also estimate, forecast where the distribution of MHDVs would be in ERCOT today, so that we could really estimate, you know, which one of those areas would see the electrification versus not. So we had to include this additional step of sort of estimating the registrations in given zip codes. And then the next step is allocating system-wide vehicle numbers to these locations. And last but not least, we have assessed results and found some limitations and made some adjustments to some of our proxy variables for different use cases. The next slide, please. So when I talk about these methods differing by the vehicle type and use case, again, just as an example, for pickup trucks, in order to figure out the location of these vehicles today, we looked at population density and number of light-duty vehicles as a proxy for the distribution of pickup trucks. And then the second one that we needed is, again, the proxies for the electrification of those vehicles, EV adoption. Then we looked at the population density and income. For the regional delivery vehicles, we have found that employment in the transportation and warehousing industry could be a good proxy. So we use the census data on employment to find out the locations of existing regional delivery vehicles. And then we use the distribution center locations to find out those zip codes that might electrify sooner than others. So again, for each vehicle type, for each use case, we had different proxies to inform our allocation method. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've also, as I mentioned this, so we've also have been in touch with the TDSPs, the utilities and ERCOT to learn what are the early or major adopters of EVs based on the information that they have. And for straight truck or regional delivery vehicle allocation, we consider the warehouses of Walmart, H-E-B, Frito-Lay, Amazon, UPS, and FedEx. So because if you know their distribution center locations, and if you know that they have plans to electrify in the coming years, those are the areas that will most likely see those EVs materialize. So we took that known piece of information into account to improve the accuracy of our allocation method. The next slide, please. So look, I have a series of these maps, and again, I'm not going to go through the details, but once we go through all these proxies, all these allocation efforts, what we have found is for each of these vehicle types, where they concentrate. So for instance, for pickup trucks, we found that pickup truck ownership is more common in rural areas. However, conditional on owning a pickup truck, an individual buying an electric pickup is more likely in urban areas. So by combining these two pieces of information, we found that highest EV pickup truck adoption was happening in suburban and city outskirt zip codes. So that kind of matches really well with sort of the expectations around us. So maybe we can cover another example if you go to the next slide. I think our next slide is regional delivery vehicles. We projected electric regional delivery vehicle adoption to occur around, again, city outskirts and along major highways where distribution centers to be located. Again, you know, some of it's obviously by design. We have incorporated information about these distribution centers and map the expected EVs to those, and that kind of how it kind of spreads to the Texas area as of 2029, as it's shown on the right-hand side. I think, Robert, you could skip the next couple of slides because the same information for lots of different types. So yeah, maybe just let me cover this one, which is, okay, so now that we've gone through allocating all of our vehicles, LDVs and MHDVs, the last step in our analysis is to figure out the impact of those EVs. And again, there are major steps. We first figure out daily vehicle miles traveled. This is the VMT point that Paige made. Then we convert those VMPs into daily energy demand. And then we figure out daily energy charger demand, and we shape those charger demands on a 24-hour charging profiles based on, again, the use case. And there are tons of assumptions, as you can see here. We take into account the location of the charge, capacity of the charge, the seasonal ambient temperature by weather, efficiency of charging based on the temperature. So all of this information is incorporated into this tool. Again, as more information, better information becomes available, ERCOT will be able to update this tool. And the next sort of output of this analysis has been, if you could move to the next slide, Robert. So just we came up with these load profiles this is at the system level. When you look at the LDVs, as expected, LDV charging is happening towards the end of the day. And the bottom chart on the right-hand side is the MHDV charging. That's happening at night and the morning hours because they're doing depot charging and distribution center charging. So this is, again, just at a high level how the information looks. And you go to the next slide, and I'm just about to wrap up here. Yeah, so I think that I don't need to summarize the results for ERCOT, but the idea is that they now have this very granular tool where they are able to see the impact of EVs materializing or expected to materialize at the substation level and plan accordingly. I want to note that, again, this is our first effort. When we were doing this analysis, there weren't even many of the similar analysis out there. There are a few startups trying to do something similar, but we wanted to make it really visible and transparent so that also ERCOT can update and communicate with the TDSPs about the need. So there are lots of limitations, and we have a whole appendix talking about the limitations of the study and what can be improved in the future. But our hope and expectation is that this is at least a good framework for folks in other jurisdictions to just try and incorporate some of these things that we've done here to reduce the uncertainty that we'll have to deal with in the coming years. With that, I think I can pause here.
Well, that's what. Thank you so very much, Dr. Sergici, and to all the presenters today. And we'll move into questions from our participants here. Jenna from Connecticut had one for Paige, which I saw Paige answered in the chat, but maybe for everybody's benefit, we can just do the Q&A here. Jenna asked, can you explain more about how make-ready programs are an example of providing flexibility? Paige, do you mind taking that one on orally as well? Is Paige still with us, Robert?
Sorry, I was double muted.
Oh, no worries.
I'm unmuted on my phone, but not here. Yeah, I was just going to reiterate kind of what I put in the chat. So we see this as being kind of a flexible source of dealing with uncertainty, since the utility is, ensuring and kind of securing a certain level of funding and a mechanism for funding infrastructure. But then that deployment is really being driven by customer or developer applications that are likely more correlated to where kind of the load is expected. So, they're not saying we're investing in charging infrastructure in this specific location, but there's a certain pool of potential funding and a mechanism to apply it that can be driven by application. Thanks.
And you had also mentioned line extensions as another potential area of flexibility. Is kind of similar answer for that.
Yeah, and I think at a different point in time of the load, like I think make ready is kind of before the load comes, there's a mechanism to prepare for it, and then a line extension is maybe after the load comes, knowing that where there's again a pool of funding to do those upgrades based on the need, and there's a mechanism to do so after that need has materialized and there's load.
Okay, great. And folks can raise their hand or continue to put questions in the chat as well. In the meantime, I kind of have a broad question. I guess this is for anybody. Maybe Dr. Sergici, it encompasses, both your areas of expertise, and given the work you've just done for ERCOT as well. And I know, like, your report has come with an appendix of I guess, conditions, or basically you have to do that, right? I mean, you can't say this is for sure. So I'm not trying to put you in a corner when I ask you, what degree of confidence would you have right now with the state of information that we have, that a proactive investment in infrastructure up to including, substation on the distribution side would be something that we could pass through to, we regulators pass through to our rate payers now, knowing that we have to balance being ready for this wave that everybody's pointing to of EVs, and not wanting to have something that ends up being not prudent sort of in the future. I just wanted your degree of confidence as we are placed today. Does that question make sense?
It does make sense, and it's $1 billion question, right? So I personally think that there's a lot of benefit to trying to be proactive, but also at the same time leveraging private investors and private participants to the extent possible. So if that's an area where private markets can participate, it could be building of a charging station. So first, trying to figure out, is that happening? Is there participation from the private market? And if for some reason there is no participation from the market, then the second consideration would be, is this development going to advance our state public policy goal? And does utilities capabilities is consistent with what we're trying to do here? And then maybe doing an experiment, right? Like, not necessarily going all the way to approving all the potential expansions in the next 5-10 years, but running a small experiment of, for the next 5 years, maybe we're going to be willing to do this just to observe how this is turning out. Because if it works, it's going to be super beneficial for the ratepayers. They're not going to have to repay for these expenses and redundant technologies. And if it turns out that it wasn't necessary, the time will come, first of all. I mean, with data centers and with all the growth that we're experiencing, I really personally don't think that any of this stuff is going to be wasted. But then you could always learn from that little experiment and inform further policymaking with that real data.
That's a really great answer. I appreciate it very much. Paige, Sean, anything to add?
Better work wasn't just something we dreamed about, but something we found. This might be the one, or better yet, no way, something that found us. I got the.
Thanks for going on mute, Kevin. Paige or Sean?
Yeah, I thought Dr. Sergici did a really good job answering there. I guess I'll underline one of the points she made around don't go all in on being proactive, right? But there is an opportunity to shape interest and shape interest by being proactive and setting up some charging stations that in areas where we think it makes sense at the moment. And I think that'll help. Even if it's not perfect, I think in this instance, perfect can be the enemy of good. And we, want to not paralyze ourselves with analysis, but rather, do what we think is best at the moment and kind of step into these processes.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I think I can just reiterate that, maybe it's not transportation electrification, but I think load is coming from other sources as well. This is just EVs, but there's other sources of load growth as well. And so, yeah.
And
investing now, I think it's a good path.
Great, that's great. I'm not seeing any any more questions in the chat? And I can't see folks if they're raising their hand, Robert. So let me know if I'm missing anybody, and if I've done so, I apologize. I guess just one more question for me, then. It was kind of a sub question to this one. That we're gaining the ability to sort of forecast at a local level. You know, it's not from everything all of you have talked about. It's pretty incredible what's happening, but we're not sort of quite there yet. I guess what in terms of, and I'm paraphrasing your collective remarks on that. What is the outlook or the timeline or will we ever be able to be, with great specificity or certain specificity, know what's happening based on time and place for where this EV charging is occurring? What's the timeline? What's the outlook?
So I'm going to answer a different question. But I think it'll be helpful. We were wrestling with this, we were talking about distribution level forecasting, and at some point, I liked Paige's chart where it showed kind of compounding uncertainty, and it grows over the more granular you get. And I asked, we had a couple of tool vendors in the task force who really specialize in load forecasting at granular levels, and I'm like, God, at what point do we no longer really trust it, or are we going through an academic exercise that isn't all that insightful? And one of the things that they generally agreed on was once you get past kind of substation level forecasting, it's really tough. And that we can do some uncertainty, we can quantify some stuff, but your error bars are so large at that, lower than a substation that it's tough. And I'm not sure we're going to super get there. I think if we embrace smart charging and really require a certain amount of smart charging, yeah, we could know exactly what everybody's charge profile would be. But I don't think we're going to do that anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, I generally agree. My hope is that some of the jurisdictions are deploying AMI 3.0. So some of these more advanced smart meters have data load disaggregation capabilities in it. If it could be possible that, these meters are really smart and all of a sudden I get an EV and it detects this EV charging load in my load, and then somehow communicates that information back to my utility. So my utility has real-time information on just one more EV popped up in this, feeders. And that dealing with that data, that amount of data and flow, I agree with Sean that it's going to take a while, but I feel like we need to get there soon, because I just think that we have all the major components of the technology available to us. The challenge will be to put everything together.
Great, thank you. Paige, anything to offer?
Yeah, I would echo other people's comments, and I just think we're a few years out to getting that level of resolution. I mean, it's just you're predicting individual actors and their charging behaviors for how, households drive, how you drive, how businesses and fleets, and I think that's a really tough thing to estimate, especially when we're in these early days of early market adopters where their behavior is going to vary pretty substantially from, people who are adopting in, 5 or 10 or 15 years.
Great. Okay, Robert, I think that, unless there's other questions that I'm not seeing, that really was 3 wonderful presentations. Thank you to each of you for spending the valuable time with us. We really appreciate it. Thank you. Robert, any other questions out there that I missed?
I'm not seeing any. I think we're good.
We can spend the last few minutes on peer sharing.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you ever so much. Thank you.